Hey internets, so if you're plugged into the world of philosophy in any level at all, you may have heard of the word consequentialism. For those who don't know, consequentialism is the metaethical idea that you could tell good from evil based on the outcome, that you judge morality of actions based on the consequences of those actions. Or in some instances, it's the idea that the ends justify the means. And so your intentions and whether or not what you're doing violates other people's rights is thus, in the consequentialist framework, considered less important than the actual real observed outcome of your actions. And there's a lot of people in philosophy who will argue that this is the biggest thing that matters. And to some degree, consequentialism does have its place. They have some relatively good points, which shows that honestly every rational being has to occasionally be consequentialist to some degree. However, overall, I've found that the consequences argument is generally not the best ethical model out there. And this video is going to explain why that is. But first off, this video does not have a sponsor, but I do have some new merch on the merch store, and I'm putting it on an introductory sale. I figured since this is a video, I'd create some cursed Fumo merch. You can get it in either purely gold and black version, or as a fully colored and customizable version. They are fairly priced at $14 and $15.99, and the profits really help me out in terms of supporting me and directly goes to helping me set aside more of my time to make more dank videos. But anyways, back to understanding consequentialism and its issues. Again, consequentialism has some good points that become apparent when you realize that the objective reality of what a person is doing isn't necessarily the same thing as what they believe that they are doing. For example, if an insane person, for whatever bizarre reason, thinks that going around with a flamethrower and setting people on fire is a good thing because they are cleansing their victim of their sins, or some similar magical justification that is very unlikely to be true, I think most people can agree, even relatively religious people can agree, that this deranged person's actions should really be rightfully judged on the outcome. Just because they believe what they're doing is virtuous doesn't really matter, does it? And it's pretty easy to understand this by simply putting yourself in the shoes of one of the people who is about to get burned. If said delusional person showed up at your doorstep, would you really care that they think they're doing the right thing as they're pointing the flamethrower at you? Or would you fight back? I mean, it's kind of an obvious question, really. However, does this mean that consequentialism really is better than everything? Do principles and virtues always matter less than consequentialism? Because as it turns out, there are quite a few good arguments out there for why consequentialism is not the best moral system to follow, and why I've come to find that respect for people's natural rights should be placed above consequentialism. Some of these arguments are common, but a couple of them are arguments I don't really see that often. There's a very big additional problem with consequentialist ethics that most people completely miss, and I find that consequentialism is highly overrated as a result of this. And so let's go over what the problems with consequentialist ethics are. Why do the ends not really justify the means? Starting with the more commonly identified problems to the more obscure ones, the ones again that everyone just kind of misses and they let slide. Despite one of the less common arguments actually being what I consider to be consequentialism's most glaring flaw. But let's start with the first one. The most common issue with consequentialism that philosophers will often bring up is that just about everyone will point out is that human beings, unfortunately, are not omniscient. We don't actually know everything, and so we can't always see into the future to foresee what that good outcome will be. No matter how certain we are in our reasoning and how well the chances of some bad thing happening fits some probability model, the reality is there are enough subjective factors in the universe that we can't actually be sure of everything. For example, going back to crazy flamethrower Fumo, what if we actually do live in crazy land? What if the insane delusions that people must be purified by fire are in fact hypothetically correct? And that if we aren't purified in this way, an even worse outcome is out there for humanity. And so you can kind of see the basic conundrum here with consequentialism. You don't really know. And so consequentialism puts you in this really bizarre situation where no one can really truly know whether or not what they're doing is actually good or evil. And therefore consequentialism is subjective to the whims of the reality that human beings don't know everything. We're not omniscient. We're not perfect. And thus consequentialist arguments often fall victim to being a form of nirvana fallacy. It only makes sense if you imagine that the perfect world the consequentialist claims will in fact happen. You have to assume that your prediction is perfectly accurate, but that perfection is often not the case. And so this really calls into question, is what flamethrower Fumo is doing really right, or is it wrong? Is it good or evil? And the reality is that consequentialism can really justify it either way. Which then brings us to the second problem with consequentialism, is that there's really no heinous act that can't be justified with consequentialist thinking. If the ends truly justify the means, then where does does the extent of the means end? This is a problem with consequentialism that is often brought up in historical contexts. Many acts of things like torture and mass murder, things that people would generally agree are bad, were done by men who believed what they were doing was for the greater good. For example, Mao Zedong tortured and murdered many people in his rise to power, and continued to do so after he had gained power. But in his mind he was right because he was radicalized by Marxism in his youth, and he believed that Marxism was the answer to all of China's problems. And yet, even when he successfully gained power and started to try and implement those policies, things didn't really work out as he planned. For instance, in the Great Leap Forward, he tried to use socialist ideas of economics to try and collectivize the farms, and of course it didn't work, it just led to millions of Chinese people starving to death. And then he made the mistake again in the Cultural Revolution, thinking he needed to forcibly stamp out Chinese traditional culture in order to force some kind of Marxist ideological purity. And this purity spiraling, all it really did was just result in the deaths of another million or so people, and of course none of this actually helped China at all. When we look back at it from a historical point of view, hindsight is 20/20, and we can actually see that China, if they had gone a completely different route, if someone with a more classical liberal mindset gained power back then instead of Mao Zedong, then China would actually be significantly better off today, possibly even better off than the United States, and they wouldn't have had to sacrifice tens of millions of people to do it. And so what we find from looking at Mao and his life is just basic proof of another problem with consequentialism, which is that consequentialism has consequences. So when you take this teleological practice, this concept that good and evil is judged entirely by its outcome, you've created an ethical system where anyone can justify anything so long as they claim that it's going to have a good outcome. But the reality is, even if you achieve your goal, you don't really know if that goal may actually end up having worse outcomes later down the line. Those consequences may have more consequences of their own. Mao just assumed that everything would be sunshine and rainbows as long as he were to gain power. The problem is his ideas were in fact very stupid and didn't work, and so there were consequences of him gaining power. And you can simplify this in philosophical terms by kind of looking at the classic trolley problem. The trolley problem is another way of looking at consequentialist ethics. It's pretty basic. If there's a trolley coming down a track and it's about to run over 5 people, would you pull the lever and switch the trolley to a track where it's only running over 1 person? And the issue with this question that everyone just kinda leaves out, or just for fun, let's call it the Mao Zedong problem, is that you don't actually know what's further down the track. You can't see what lies beyond this gaping abyss. It's just assumed that that's the end of the question. It's just you, the trolley, the lever, and these 6 people, and everything else is just an isolated variable. But that's not how reality actually works, is it? In the real world, time goes on. So how do you know that there aren't people further down the line in the trolley? What if diverting the train will actually lead to an even greater disaster? And so when we're confronted with the reality that human beings do not possess this perfect, omniscient, magical knowledge of everything that's going to happen, it suddenly becomes quite clear that people don't really know what it is they're doing. Which, speaking about the trolley problem, this leads to the third major issue with consequentialism, which is that consequentialism kind of hits differently when it's your arse on the line. For example, is it good to torture one person for the rest of their life if it results in 10 other impoverished people, each being given $10 million so that they can live their life to the fullest, never wanting for anything anymore? Basically, is one person's misery worth 10 other people's happiness? A fairly common consequentialist question. But what if it's you that's tied to that trolley? Or in the misery question, would you volunteer yourself to live the rest of your life being tortured in some chamber, being whipped and beaten every day, if it meant helping 10 other people out? Or even worse, what if it wasn't voluntary? What if someone was forcing you into the torture chamber, regardless of whether or not you consented to it? And so now it's someone else deciding for you and forcing you to accept that your misery is worth the happiness of 10 other people. And so it's not so easy to try and claim that consequentialism is the ultimate end-all be-all to what is right and what is wrong when you try and put yourself into the equation. It's easy from an outside third-person perspective to say, okay, yeah, sacrificing one person for whatever outcome is a good thing. But what if you're the one that's being sacrificed? It's suddenly not so fun, is it? And putting yourself into the equation brings me to one of the scenarios that most people miss, one of the less common issues with consequentialism. For instance, you may have heard of something called Pascal's wager, which is a pragmatic argument for believing in God, based on the assumption that not believing in God will result in you going to hell, but believing in him will result in you going to heaven. And so since you gain nothing through non-belief and have everything to gain through belief, therefore you should believe, under the chance that it might send you to heaven. Now, there are good arguments and bad arguments in favor of theology, or if there's some greater force beyond the universe, but when you think about it, you'll realize that Pascal's wager isn't a very good one. And the problem with it, and what a lot of people don't realize about it, and this is where one of the less common things people notice about consequentialism lies, is that Pascal's wager is actually a false dichotomy. Do X bad thing, or else Y bad outcome will happen, is a false dichotomy asserting that there is no third possibility, which is that doing X bad thing will create an even worse scenario, Z, an even worse outcome. What if God is actually testing us, and the only people he sends to hell are in fact the people who only believe in him because they think that not doing so will result in them going to hell? That may sound silly, but it's actually a very real critique of Pascal's wager, because Pascal's wager is really just a consequentialist argument, and so it has the same issue as the trolley problem. You don't really know what's going to happen, and you don't actually know if there's something else entirely that is completely beyond your comprehension that may actually be even worse. And what's funny is I often see the people who point this out are often consequentialists themselves, without realizing that this problem of Pascal's wager actually applies to just about every single hypothetical consequentialist scenario. So for instance, in a debate, someone who believes that a person's rights are more important than consequentialism, the consequentialist might ask them something like, oh yeah, but what if aliens are going to destroy the Earth and they tell you that they will blow the Earth up unless you steal a candy bar from this store? And so in other words, the consequentialist is effectively stating, oh what, you think that stealing is wrong? Well, what if you had to steal in order to save the Earth? Ho, natural rights destroyed. But there's a problem with this reasoning. If you think about it, you'll realize that this is really just a secular version of Pascal's wager. What if the aliens are actually testing us? What if they plan to view humanity as a threat and destroy the Earth if you do steal the candy bar? And this of course just all distracts from the reality that, hey, maybe, just maybe, both shoplifting and blowing up the Earth are wrong things to do. Which then brings us to another thing people don't notice and just kind of let slide with these hypothetical scenarios in favor of consequentialism. Not only do they presume perfect knowledge that nobody actually has, and are thus guilty of a false dichotomy in regards to scenario Z, but another common factor with consequentialist arguments is that the bad stuff they mention is just almost always about property rights. These hypotheticals always either put people's belongings on the line or put their lives on the line. And maybe, just maybe, that's because we inherently know that that's what really matters. And so there's actually some inherent circularity in the reasoning of the teleological point of view. How does the consequentialist even know what a quote-unquote bad outcome is anyways, without first considering the morality of the action itself? And so consequentialism must therefore have a foundation of human rights to make that decision. And this is what I see as consequentialism's most glaring flaw. It's not a real, complete moral philosophy on its own. Rather, instead, it's just a thinly veiled alternative version of collectivism, where it places collective outcomes above individual rights. But it can't do that unless it first acknowledges the good of those individual rights. And if that's the case, then when the consequentialist violates those rights, then logically what they're doing must be wrong. And so if stealing and everyone dying is both bad, then this brings us to another fourth possibility. Shouldn't we instead be focused on avoiding both Y bad thing and X bad thing? Maybe, just maybe, it's better to, not violate anybody's rights, and perhaps we should stop listening to would-be communist dictator number 552 when he fearmongers about how we have to give up all of our property rights or else the meteor of doom is going to come any day now. And so when you look at things instead from the standpoint of acknowledging that rights are a thing, you can instead just say that it's wrong to steal a candy bar, and it's also wrong to blow up the Earth. It's definitely a lot more reasonable than trying to use false dichotomies to convince ourselves that human rights don't exist. And so the real problem with consequentialism is that people are putting the cart before the horse. This doesn't mean that consequentialism is bad, it's just that it's easy for us to lose sight of what really matters. And thus, in the hierarchy of morality, the more rational view is that consequentialist arguments are only valid so long as the consequentialist is not posing an idea that would violate somebody else's rights. Because the reality is, those are the rights that really matter. That's what we really care about. And thus, consequentialism should be used to defend those rights. When you use consequentialist thinking to justify taking those rights away, that's when you have a fallacy on your hands. That's where you find yourself wearing the same stupid boots that Mao Zedong was wearing. That's when you've lost the plot. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by becoming a member of the channel, or by buying some merch, of which again I've just released some new Fumo-based merch at a temporary introductory sale price. And a link to that will be included in the description below. But yeah, again, that is all. Till next time.